All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Kyle Barnhart. I'm with the GVSU Alumni Relations Office. Our topic today is Finding the Good Life, and I'm joined by three Grand Valley faculty members for today's discussion. Dr. Dianne Green-Smith is a professor of social work. She was born and raised in New Orleans in an entirely segregated community. She's one of six children, and her parents had only a third and eighth grade education. She earned her bachelor's degree in social work and sociology from Xavier University in New Orleans, her master's degree in social work from Tulane University, and a PhD in social work from the Loyola University in Chicago. Her work over the years has included placing babies for adoption in 4 states across the South, working in a maternity group home, working for family services agencies, doing family reunification and family preservation, among many other things. She began teaching at Grand Valley as an adjunct in 1999 and joined the faculty as a visiting professor in 2001. She served as the director of the School of Social Work from 2011 to 2017 and directs the Social Work Ghana Study Abroad program. She is married with 4 children and 8 grandchildren. Dr. Christopher Kurby is an associate professor of psychology. His expertise is in cognitive aging and memory. He received his PhD in cognitive psychology from Northern Illinois University and completed 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one at the University of Memphis and the other at Washington University in St. Louis. His research interests include how we perceive and remember events in our life and how they change as we age. Dr. John Uglietta, trying to pronounce that correctly, is a professor of philosophy. He's been with GVSU for 17 years, including the past 10 as the chair of the philosophy department. Prior to joining Grand Valley, he taught at Ohio State University and the University of Maryland. He earned degrees in philosophy from Johns Hopkins University and the University of Chicago, and has a law degree from the University of Michigan. He studies and writes on ethics and meaning in life and has given presentations on theories of meaning in life in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Thank you all for joining us today. Very much looking forward to this conversation. As our community and our country sort of emerge from this pandemic, we're really at an inflection point, and the events of the past year have caused a lot of people to kind of step back and think about their lives and what they want to be doing personally and professionally, and how they want to be living. And so I think this conversation is very timely. It also, of course, is loosely connected to our current Read with Lakers book, The Midnight Library. Not required reading for today's topic, but some connection there. To start off, I'd just like to ask each of you to share a few opening thoughts on the good life, maybe what that means to you, or how you've been thinking about it, or any background you have that you can bring from your personal and professional expertise to this. So, John, maybe we can start with you, since you've written a little bit about this topic from the philosophy side of things.
Sure. I guess to start, I thought the book was, if you didn't read it, it was a fun read to give it a try. It's sort of a new twist. There's all sorts of movies and books where people get to figure out, sort of go back and see what their life might have been like, or what they're experimenting with. But it's never been quantum mechanics that got you there. It was always, a genie or an angel or even the devil in some cases. But this time it was some vague quantum mechanic feature that sent us to be able to explore the different lives we might have had. I guess I'm always, whenever I talk about meaning in life, I start out as a little bit nervous because, when you say some life is good, or you start thinking about one life as good, there's this, you always are saying some lives are not as good too. And people tend to take this as a kind of harsh criticism. You can't help but feel like everyone's looking at you going, well, who are you to tell me that life is not that good? So I always like to sort of center or thinking about this around that what you're really trying to do is figure out how you want to live, right? That as you look at other people's lives largely as examples, really to think about what might be good about that life, or that you might draw from it. Really, it's not kind of criticism of other people so much as it is exploration yourself. So in the book, she actually gets to explore all the different lives herself in a rather odd way that we don't get. Now, it's also, I guess when I think about a good life, I'm never sure everybody's talking about the same thing, right? The good life, I take it to be this sort of large overarching concept of an entire life, or at least large swaths of it, in this general sense of good. Because sometimes people, when they have a problem or they're concerned about a good life, they're talking about sort of their life lacking. Quite frequently lately, if their life's been lacking either satisfaction or perhaps meaning or sometimes pleasure. And I think these are all dimensions that play into a good life, right? A life can be a moral life, a useful life, a valuable life. And they're all slightly different things, but it's my view that they all contribute to this larger idea of a good life. It's sort of hard to imagine a life that was terrifically useful or even meaningful, but it was horribly unpleasant. We probably wouldn't think of that as a good life. Similarly, lives that are pleasant but sort of frivolous don't strike us as good lives. So sometimes part of the thing is sort of narrowing down just what people's concerns are in that. I'm not sure whether the pandemic brought out any particular features with that. There's been a couple obvious things that have come up, but I guess I should add too, I like the way in the book they go through the images of a library. And when I think of good lives, I've often thought of it in terms of a library. There's usually, when you go into a library, particularly one of the old majestic ones with so many millions of books, it's sort of daunting, and you don't go in thinking, what I want to find is the best book out of these 10 million, right? You generally think, look, there's a bunch of good books in there, and I want to pick one of those good books. You can admit there's some that are not as good or not very good, but you don't try to rank them or try to distill just what's so great about one particular one. And I think of lives that way, that as a good life, there's a tendency for everybody to want to rank everything to find the very best one, and that gets them caught up in sort of this myth of getting more and more of one thing or devoting to one thing. And sometimes that can be counterproductive. What you want is, it's not sort of seeking the good life, it's not particularly a competitive sport or anything like that. You're not really trying to beat someone else or prove that your life is better. It sort of wouldn't get you much. Now, I think the pandemic, what Kyle, you said, this sort of got people thinking about this. And the way I've been thinking about that is, it's sort of like that, how when you see it just forced people to pause and think about things that they hadn't thought about. There's a sense in which, like when you're at the action movie or the mystery movie, things just move along so fast. You don't stop and think about them until after you leave, and then you realize, well, that's not working, right? That doesn't make sense. And the pandemic forced everybody to slow down so much. I think it got a lot of people to think and rethink, perhaps, about things that they just had not revisited in a while. And they found some of them wanting, quite frankly. Some of that, I think, was, in an odd way, purely philosophical. That is, sometimes, right, it's just they hated their job and they should probably change. But a lot of times we get so caught up in the daily activities of our the things we do every day, the mundane tasks of our work, we sort of lose sight of what was good about it. And that can cause a kind of loss of meaning because we don't see anything in our work. But it strikes me that sometimes you could get that back simply by stepping back and realizing why you did do the things you do. I know as a teacher, going online made me question the whole prospect. Sometimes the class was so different, it was I didn't seem to get the same thing out of it. And I remember last term I had a class in person, and it was just fantastic to be back doing it again. It really sort of reinvigorated me, made me realize, oh, this is the good part. This is what I liked about this. So sometimes it's just perspective or understanding, but I've probably said too much. Let me give some other people some.
Thank you. Dianne, any thoughts to get us started?
Yeah, just a little bit. I was just thinking as John was talking, I don't actually think about life as being good or bad. So I never really think about my life as good. I just think about life in terms of context of family, because I live multi-generational. And so when and I also had an opportunity to read the book, but more in terms of how we have different lives and how different segments of those lives have different meanings for us, depending upon where we are at a particular point in time. And so sometimes we dream about what life might look like, and then we might see that, at one point or another, just as Nora did in the book. and not recognize the significance of what could actually be good at a particular time, even if it didn't seem to be good. I remember living in Maryland, and I really did not like Maryland. And so I was ready to move back here. I don't know. So I actually work on Charles Street, right around the corner from John Hopkins Hospital. But I didn't like Maryland because, I'm just didn't like it. I didn't like how the state is made, something as silly as how the state is made. But I prayed all the time, and I heard a song all the time coming home because I lived in another county. And it was a Daryl Coley music record about he's pruning me, he's preparing me, and so forth and so on. So I look at life as getting ready for one thing, but staying in place where you are. So it's a good life at that particular time, and then you continue to move and continue to grow. So I'm not quite sure if I answered that in terms of the good life, but life for me has to have purpose and meaning and sharing it with someone to be good, even if the times are not that good, like the pandemic.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, so to build off of what John and Diane were saying, so I don't claim to have any good advice about how to live a good life or not. But I do like to think about what does it mean, my expertise is in parts what it means to grow older, and psychologically what changes. And one of the strangest mysteries of the human experience is we all have minds and we are aware of our minds, but at the same time, we have almost no access to how they work or why they work, which is, of course, why we need a field called philosophy, why we need a field called psychology. For example, we don't have much intuition about what are sort of like adaptive decisions or maladaptive decisions in development or as we grow up. So, for example, I think a lot of people aspire to, maybe retiring early and, just kind of kicking back for, in their end of their lifespan. And the goal is that, it'll bring happiness. But there's a lot of research on this topic, and what seems to find is when you're looking at what factors might predict, let's say, longevity and health, people who retire early tend to have shorter lifespans and worse health than people who don't. And there are all these other kind of examples. So one view is that especially these days, parents are very interested in getting their kids involved in academics early, and maybe starting them into like early preschools, academically focused preschools, and maybe trying to get their kids into school like a year early, for example. And the belief is it'll give them a head start. And certainly, like Michigan has tried to dip its toes in this one way or another, like maybe extend the school year, start them early, things like that. What these studies show is that children who start first grade early are more likely to have sort of middle-age stressors like alcohol abuse issues, later health decrements, and shorter lifespans. Then the list goes on. So what Diane said was, I don't really want to judge things as good or bad. That's good advice, because it turns out like humans can't make the right decisions as far as that goes. And one thing that Diane said is that, well, having life purpose seems to matter. And certainly actually newer research on, what does predict sort of happiness in older age is strongly predicted by a feeling of like purpose and belongingness in where you are in life, like connections with other people, or how you're contributing to society, things like that.
Thank you. Three very different, but I think incredibly interesting opening thoughts there. We're going to move now into just some questions, and we'll have some dialogue here between our panelists. We have questions that were submitted in advance during the registration, so we'll start with some of those, but if any of our attendees have questions as we go along, you can drop those in the Q&A feature at the bottom, and we'll address as many of those as we can as we go along here. So one theme I saw in the questions, and maybe Dianne, will start with you, with your social work background, might help us here. Helping others as they kind of struggle to figure out what their good life looks like. You know, how can we support them in identifying that, or be conscious of their struggle to kind of find their meaning?
Sometimes when I'm working with people, if I'm doing clinical work, it's a matter of hearing people's stories. You know, what brought you here? What are you struggling with at this particular time? And what are you hoping for? You know, what are your expectations for yourself in terms of life? And it's all about relationships, and it's about meaning, and it's about things that's unfinished for them. And so sometimes their expectations are for others, but basically you have to begin with yourself. So when I'm working with anybody, clinically, or even with my students, as we discussed, because most of my classes are clinically based, it is getting to know yourself and your own objects that you've internalized, you know, separating yourself from some of those things, because those things are not all of who you are. And because I live in a collective society, it is not always just about that person, but it is most of our lives and our problems come as a result of relationships that we have. And also from environmental factors, and just looking at all those things and how that person can continue to grow and evolve so they can have a life that gives them purpose, a life that gives them meaning. And that is a process. And so you have things that push you forward and then things that push you back. And so how do you find a balance so that you can have the life you anticipate and want to live?
And another, to kind of build on that, and for anybody here, there is a question about work-life balance and kind of how we manage that in the context of trying to find this meaning, right? We need to work, right? Most of us to support financially, but there's all these components of life that don't revolve around work that we find a lot of joy or a lot of meaning in. So how do we find that balance, between our maybe material needs and our more, psychological or emotional needs? Anybody?
Oh, I guess I don't know that I think of them. I understand the distinction you're making, the sort of material needs and the psychological, but I think part of the trouble sometimes is in thinking that the work life falls only in one category there, and the rest of your life falls in the other. Even the way Dianne described the social work she's doing, you can see that, look, there's a personal element that you gain from that as well as the professional element. And part of the difficulty is maybe in sometimes seeing work as just work, right? That is, so it's only exclusively, I'm doing this because I have to. And it's perhaps an integration, maybe of the way you think about trying to get something out of it. It's probably never going to be all that pleasant if you're always, I guess the balance strikes me as not going to be all that successful. If it means, okay, for 30% of my day, I'm going to just devote myself to work and think of nothing else. Because you're going to have to like what you do and have to like the people you do it with and the setting you're in, and feel like you're doing something at work and at home or wherever else you are. But I think part of that too is people, I don't know enough about other countries, but it sure seems like we work a lot in America, and people identify themselves so exclusively with their work that itself simply places too much emphasis on that one aspect of your life to sort of deliver too many other features. So it simply can't create all of the things one needs in a good life. So if you're a successful person, successful people, you probably all know them. They're well off, and they don't even have time to eat lunch or to to cook dinner or to talk to people, you think, well, that's obviously gone too far, right? That is, you need something else in your life. But you also probably need to make the work part itself more meaningful to you.
John, I was thinking about as you were talking, because work-life balance, I think is you have to be very intentional about it. It's really hard, particularly during this pandemic time. And I don't know for you guys, but I live multi-generational. And so there's 3 generations of people in this house. And so as you try to find balance, particularly when we had to work offline, off campus, but online, there was no balance. It was a matter of really trying to learn how to Zoom, how to do Blackboard, how to take a tutorial, write notes from the tutorial, and then watch the tutorial again, right? And then the responsibilities you have to your family, responsibilities you have to yourself. I think work-life balance is something that ebbs and flows, depending upon what your living situation is. If you live by yourself, maybe you can maybe think more about yourself and what your needs are. But for me, it's more of a collectivist decision in terms of what work-life balance is and how other people in your life can support you so that you can have a more balanced life. And that balanced life, one week it may be more balanced than another week. It may tip more to the work side, depending upon what needs to be done. But I think as long as you can be aware of where your stress levels are, because when it's not balanced, there is that stress that we internalize that can make us unhealthy, psychologically and physically unhealthy. So again, work-life balance is something that you work on all the time, so that you can have some time for yourself. Even in a crowded home, have some time for yourself and practice some self-care. I think that's really critical as we try to establish good work-life balance. And your workplace has to recognize that that is very important for you to have, so that the expectation is that you're not working, forever, 10 hours a day, reading papers.
Yeah, man, I mean, these are good points. I don't know if maintaining a work-life balance is any sort of key to happiness. I mean, like John said, I don't know if it's useful to like divide yourself like that. Ultimately, I know this is a very broad answer, but I think whatever brings you happiness. I certainly know people who maybe have 90% work, 10% life, and that's a good balance for them. I mean, what brings you happiness, I think, is more important than a goal to maintain any sort of balance. I mean, a balance is, there's no objective balance, right? I tell my students who, when they ask me about like career options and things, I think a lot of students want to find jobs that make them money, and that's more important to them sometimes than like the particulars of the job. And the goal is they want to make as much money as possible. And I'm not going to discourage them at all, but what I ask them is, let's think about what your day-to-day life will be, your moment to moment. When you are at that job and they ask you to do a task, ask yourself, will I be happy doing that task? And certainly like they don't know the future, but I think that's something that people don't really ask themselves when they're looking for future careers. And, in my experience, remembering like your day-to-day constraints and what might bring you happy day-to-day may bring more happiness than a paycheck you get from a job that you do what John said you probably shouldn't do, divide yourself into my work self and my personal self. And I know that not everyone can get a job that they love and make them happy. Like that's clearly true. But it doesn't mean that you can't find something that maybe can drive you in your job, whatever it is. And this reminds me of when I have students come to me and say, I can't stand, I can't stand this topic, or I can't stand this class. And I ask them, but is there something like based on what you like, what your knowledge you have, the experience you have. Is there something you can find that can, in this topic, that can link to that? And if you can find that, maybe use that to push yourself into something that's interesting. And yeah, I don't know. So ultimately, I think that is more important than worrying about like, do I have a perfect balance here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something else too about the work life balance thing. I think it really depends upon the age people are too, and what their life experiences are and what they are experiencing in terms of health and other needs. So work life balance is, for me, it is really more family focused, because we don't live in isolation. We live with others. And when people are really nearing death, sometimes they look at their life. They have an overview of, did I spend more time working, or did I spend more time on relationships, meaningful relationships? And what is it I would want to see different? When you look at Nora, right? At the end of it, actually, she wanted to live. She wanted a life where she thought her life was purposeful and meaningful, but purpose changes. It's not always about the big thing in life that's important. It's sometimes about the little things, like the relationship she had with her brother, and how significantly important that was for him, that she not die, that she stays there. And so sometimes when we're looking for balance or we're looking for work, sometimes we're searching for the wrong thing. So that work-life balance doesn't necessarily mean a job that pays. As people age and mature, it could be, doing volunteer work. That's work too. Giving back. That how do you balance giving back and receiving at the same time? Because sometimes that there's an imbalance when you serve, but you don't know how to receive. So I think it's a matter of fact of looking at work-life balance is more than just working for a paycheck, but it's also working to give without expecting anything in return, and what that means to someone, and finding balance in their lives, their spiritual lives, their emotional well-being and psychological well-being. That's what I think about.
I want to shift just slightly here, and Chris, I'm wondering if maybe your psychology can kind of help us think about this. Decision making. You mentioned that people, humans are inherently not very good at judging good or bad. Do we, so when it comes to making a decision and being confident in that and living with it for a little bit, of course, there's always comes a time that we need to reevaluate maybe, but how can we think about, are we really good at judging what the potential is for the future, how this could, play out? How can we think about being confident in our decision making?
Well, I'm not a particular expert in decision making, but I do know some of the classic works. So uh, um, there's some important work that won Nobel Prize back a couple of decades ago about how we make decisions about, like, let's say, financial decisions. And it turns out what people do is, even though they think they're being logical, what they tend to do is make decisions based on the first thing that comes to mind. And we call that availability heuristic. And that can lead to a lot of interesting effects, like people being afraid of sharks when they're in the ocean, when the odds of being eaten by a shark are minuscule, almost zero, right? But what comes to mind is being attacked by a shark, and that's very vivid, and that can affect our decision making, for example. So certainly, like, one thing that you might want to be aware of is, when you're confronted with a decision situation, is to think about, like, all right, what has come to mind, and is that something that actually is a factor that matters?
That's interesting that, I don't think any of us ever feel like we're going with the first decision, right? Maybe that gut instinct a little bit. We feel like it's rational, but to hear you say the science says, is really stopping to make me think a little bit about some decisions I've made recently, right? Small things even, but was that really the first thing I thought about? And that's why I went with it. So that's some interesting insight. John, this might be best addressed by you. We have a question, wondering how this concept of the good life, right? Using that term kind of broadly, meaningful, or whatever it means to the individual. Do we see differences in kind of the good life, the concept of the good life for people who of various religious backgrounds? Is there differences, across religion?
So I guess certainly in respect, since religions vary so widely, yeah, there can be big differences. But there's a sort of way of thinking about it. Generally, religion can contribute in a number of ways. One is obviously, most people think that there's a moral component to a good life. So religions often have will specify a moral standards that people can live by. So we wouldn't think it a good life if you were a wonderfully successful criminal, right? Even if you were happy with it. But sort of along the lines that Chris was talking about, there's a confidence sometimes that religious belief can bring to decision making. That is, there's a certain amount of meaning sometimes as a function of how wholeheartedly you can confidently believe in what you're doing. So if that's a component of a good life, the true believer sometimes has a strong sense of purpose that's very difficult to shake, in which case they can, in a sense, charge into the things they're doing in a way that could only be half-hearted for someone else. And you can see it in a lot of people. Their religious faith sort of drives them and inspires them to take on tremendous tasks sometimes. Now, I'm not saying you can't get that. You can get that. Other people find that purpose in other things as well. But that it can be a particularly inspiring dimension and contribute to meaning in that way. For instance, I was watching the U.S. track and field championships are on this week. And it's surprising how many, the different things people will say when they've just won the national championship, and they've clearly worked terrifically hard. And sometimes they say what's driving them is they really want to get to the Olympics, and sometimes they say what's driving them is they want to give glory to God. And it's quite clear that this sort of gives a purpose to their life, or makes them see quite clearly that. So that's the biggest effect I see there, really. That is, that stronger believers tend to have a sort of more wholehearted embrace sometimes. But of course, there are people of all different strengths of religious belief as well. So in that sense, it doesn't always work either.
Another question, that we have here is, I think particularly relevant, right, with with social media as prevalent as it is, and that idea of comparisons, right? How, the temptation to constantly compare ourselves to others, or to have somebody else defining what a good life looks like. So, for any of you, how do we step back from that, right? It's in social media and media in general, right? It's so pushed at us and so ingrained into our lives. How do we step back from that comparison and really think about, is this my good life? Is this really a good life, what I'm seeing out here? And how do we stop that comparison, minimize that temptation to draw comparisons?
Well, I don't know, other than limit your exposure. So, a lot of, current research in like exposure to social media and this phenomena called fear of missing out, which I'm sure a lot of audience members know, shows that essentially the strongest predictor to reduce fear of missing out is limiting exposure to social media. Of course, we're trying to understand like what kind of exposure to social media has negative influences, and we're not totally sure, but different ways of engaging social media seem to matter. So there is a more active way to engage social media where you are, posting things, trying to make new connections, maintain relationships, things like that. those can be associated with positive outcomes. A more passive engagement with social media, kind of scrolling through and seeing all the pictures people have from their vacation trips and all that kind of thing, and just sort of like absorbing it, has been associated with negative outcomes in social media exposure. So, but if I had a recommendation, it would be simply just limit your exposure in general.
Mine is so limited. It's hard for me to comment on this, but
Or in general, right? It's easy to hear someone, a student in another class say, oh, that, reference something about their life, or a coworker reference something about their life, or use, even at a stoplight, right? Oh, this person has a fancy car.
no, in fact, I remember this came up I had a class last term, the one I in fact said was great, and it was striking. I forget what the topic was that day, but it turned out that the way that it infected their lives, the students, was tremendous. Like that, it was the first thing that one that came up, and that it's all anybody talked about. I guess my part of it is, there's so many things in that, and people who know it better could say more, but it strikes me there's a sense of, for better or worse, just believing too much of what one sees on social media, but also just the sense of there's a sort of lack of confidence that requires you to judge everything by comparison, right? To always be thinking that you need to be doing as well or just like someone else. Maybe it ties into Chris's point that we take the first opportunity. So somebody else suggests this was great, so I haven't done it, so it must not be good for me, rather than thinking, well, I don't actually like that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking quickly at our questions here. One that I think is kind of intriguing here is, is being meaningful substantially different than being purposeful or functional?
Yes.
Mm.
No, I mean, the easiest way to show functional is with silly examples, right? That is, you could be useful in all kinds of ways that are not meaning, you could be useful accidentally as a bad example to people. That would be useful or functional, but wouldn't be meaningful for you because you thought you were doing something good. I take it that meaning requires somebody, it ties in though, right? Because there's a notion in useful or functional of value. And generally speaking, I'd say to find meaning, you have to be pursuing value. That is, you have to recognize something as good and to pursue it. And then you find meaning in the fact that you're doing that. But of course, the danger there is that you kind of get it wrong. We often pursue things that we think are meaningful, right? And there's countless books about that, right? About people who pursued fame or money or power or something and then found out they were not the thing they wanted. But so I stop there, see what other people have to say about that.
I'm not quite sure too much about that. I was just thinking about Ecclesiastes, not that I read it, because everything is meaningless, so to speak, in that particular book. But because I've used the word meaningful and I've used purpose, and I think there's different ways that we interpret that too. So meaningful could be, are you doing something that's going to be helpful to others? How are you going to look at doing something for others as meaningful, that it is going to be helpful to that particular person or group or whatever. And then I use the word purpose too a lot too, in terms of, does my life then have a purpose or meaning? I think sometimes we kind of put those two words together in terms of what life is supposed to be. We have to live for something. And so what is it that we live for? You gave the example of the athlete who won and gave praise to God. And so, because that's that person's foundation, a person has to have a foundation of belief in something in order for their life to serve something other than themselves, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that's just, but it's just something good, I guess, written into what you say there is you think those things are good.
Mhm.
And we generally think helping other people is also good. We wouldn't think the same, notice, if we thought if you help somebody do something that was bad,
Right.
right? You're assuming that we're going to do something good. Um, although I guess I would throw in, I don't know that there's one thing. It strikes me that we may have many sources of value that we pursue in life. A life doesn't have to be a sort of single thread story. It has different chapters and different pieces where we pursue different sorts of things. But in all cases, I think we want to think that those things are good. We're trying to pursue something of value. And I think it's just fine distinction between whether we're calling that meaning or purpose. I think.
As products of various higher education systems and faculty members now at Grand Valley, what role do universities play in fostering individuals' search for the good life or fostering the good life for the greater public?
The danger of lapsing into advertising here, isn't there? So I guess it strikes me there's a number of different ways this might happen. But simply on the personal level that you mentioned first, certainly what universities can do is equip students, right? That is, they open up a whole lot of possibilities. That's what education opens up, a number of possibilities, because your understanding of the world increases so much that you can both see things that are there that you wouldn't have noticed before that might be good or of value or worth pursuing. You can also learn to evaluate them, though, so that you can be a sort of critical assessor of whether things are of value, right? That is, you can see through things that maybe are not worthwhile. Aside from the obvious things in which, they give you skills and talents, and education does, to pursue lives that might be, you simply can't get into certain kind of work unless you are capable in certain kinds of ways, that an education makes you capable. But I don't see if anybody else wants to plug straight for their class why that's going to make people have more meaningful lives.
Many students in social work go into social work. Looks like my internet is unstable, but many of them go into social work because of challenges they've had in their lives, whatever those challenges may be, or challenges they've seen within their family. And so the opportunity for an education provides them with a way of reaching out. So if I had a student who was in foster care, they really have a heart for what other children may be experiencing. And so they go into it because they want to serve. That's what we see in social work. People really have struggled, they've seen it, and they want to make a difference. So it is making a meaningful difference so that somebody can go down a path that will provide them with greater opportunities. So when I'm looking at education, it is not just for themselves as social workers, but how can they make a life worth meaning for someone else?
And if I can make a case for the general benefits of education, it would be that with increased knowledge typically comes increased richness of experience. The more knowledge we have of events or people or objects, the more deeply we can think about them, consider why it's important, and make connections. And certainly, like, that actually fits in with the spirit of Grand Valley as a liberal arts college. The whole point is give you a rich set of knowledge, or at least exposure to a rich set of topics, so that we can find value in lots of experiences. And I think a lot of us can feel this ourselves. If you have something that you're interested in or passionate about, the more you learn about it, the more you engage, the more interesting it gets. And that's in part because the increase in knowledge, it usually results in increased richness.
Well, as we, start to approach the end of our time here, I want to, once again thank the three of you for kind of helping us tackle this very abstract concept. And I appreciate all of the the different comments, and I do want to give, an opportunity if anybody has any final, parting comments or thoughts or wisdom to share with the audience here as we kind of conclude. No pressure, but as we kind of wrap up here, any final thoughts?
I guess if I have a final thought, it would probably, it's storming out here right now. It would probably be on regrets, that topic about regrets. And so when you're going through your life, there's probably some times when you maybe regret a particular choice you may have made. But I always look at those things that we've done in life prepares us for the next thing. So we can stop and we can reflect and we can evaluate, why did I do that? That was really kind of dumb or kind of stupid or kind of whatever concept you want to put there. But
I think we lost Diane's audio.
um,
Any Chris or John, anything you want to add? Maybe, well, hopefully Diane will come back in a moment here. We'll chalk it up to the weather.
I guess I would throw in, I did scan a question in the chat there. And I guess I would want to clarify something. I guess I have been saying, and I don't know, I'm not sure Chris was saying this either, but it's not, we're not saying simply pursue things you like in a sort of, there's some of these things could be quite difficult. There's the things you find purposeful or meaningful, you're engaged with, you think that they're valuable. It doesn't mean just sort of they make me happy in the moment. These can be long-term, serious projects. In fact, some of the things that people, particularly I think Chris was describing this, you get yourself wrapped up in this, and people can take on tremendous hardship sometimes to pursue these things, but it simply has increased what they take out of it. The sort of the life that's in that pursuit is much greater. So I wouldn't, this is part of just a general slide in the meaning of happiness, right? That is, sometimes when we're like, I know as a philosopher, when we're talking about happiness, we need this sort of overarching, everything's working kind of a full in the best way, not this sort of transitory passing feeling of happiness, which is not bad either, but it's not something necessarily to plan.
Yeah, I'm certainly not trying to promote hedonism or something. And in fact, like, pursuit of short-term happiness doesn't always result in long-term happiness. Like, here's an example. There's programs to bring, like, puppies and dogs into hospitals and have patients, pet them and be with them. And certainly that brings short-term happiness. But what we've seen in studies is once the pets are gone, then the happiness drops back to baseline. There's no long-term benefits. So
I guess one more wrinkle, it didn't really come up, and it was an interesting feature of the book, I thought, or well, really two things. One was that it's easy to shortchange. We were talking about education. Sometimes when you're counseling students or something, it's very hard to know too. Some things you kind of live into them. That is, you got to recognize that your perspective changes when you are in it. And this is, again, relates to what Chris was saying about when you get into and learn more about things. There's certain things, you don't know how much you may like them when you're actually doing them. Sometimes you actually have to do them to appreciate them. I think of taking my kids to a famous art museum and seeing them seeking the water fountain or the air conditioning duct, right? They didn't get any of it. They were too young. But here, your perspective changes. That's why I thought the book was a little bit odd, because she sort of jumped into lives. And if you didn't sort of live into it, you don't necessarily have the perspective of the person that's in it, right? And they may get more out of it. I did like, though, that she recognized in the end, those of you who read the book, that like living the good life comes from a verb, to live, right? You have to actively do it. Right, and she recognized that she couldn't just sort of buy into somebody else's life. And maybe that's part of the social media answer, I guess I would give too. Maybe I'm still lingering on that those are other people's lives. You need to sort of, what you're after is not comparison and not competition. It's living your own life. And you have to actually do that, not sort of just portray that.
And I think, John, that's probably a good point related to regret too, right? How can we truly regret something if we weren't able to live it through? regret not doing something, maybe in that sense. Diane, I think it seems like you're back.
Oh, was I gone the whole time?
Well, not the whole time, but we did lose your audio for a little bit, so I want to make sure you had a chance to get all your thoughts out here before we wrap it up.
Okay, because I was able to listen, but right, life is worth living. All of it is interconnected, and whether we regret something or not depends upon how serious that is that we might regret. But we haven't. I think I'm not stable again. Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I think life is just worth living. And so there's some things we may not be excited about, that decisions we may have made, but it makes us who we are. And as long as we can live a life that we're happy with, that's pleasing to others too, if that's important to us. For me, it is. But don't shortchange ourselves in that process, and just keep moving forward. All of it is knitted together.
Well, thank you again to all three of you for joining us, and to our attendees for joining us today. We're going to drop a link in the chat to a real quick survey. We'd appreciate your feedback today. There it is. We'll also stick that we'll send a follow-up email out in the next few days. I'll have this recording along with the survey link. And then, of course, we would encourage alums to keep an eye on our events calendar for upcoming events, and we put the link to that in the chat as well. So thank you again to our panelists and our attendees, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.